Okay, so I think we can start. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening for everybody. Welcome to the UFMG Constitutionalism and Democracy Seminar Series. The seminars are an initiative of the graduate program in law of Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil, and the Digital Const, UFMG, Content Governance Research, with the support of the UFMG Study Center on Transitional Justice, the UFMG GNet Research Group, the UFMG Center on Transnational and Comparative Juridical Studies, the ICONES Chapter Brazil, the Graduate Program in Law of the Federal University of the Semi-Arid Brazil, the Graduate Program in Law of the Federal University of Uberlândia, Brazil, University of Brasilia, Brazil, and the Brazilian Association of Political Philosophy and Constitutional Law, Brazil. So yes, we are here in Brazil. Although the results of the presidential elections in the United States indicated a point of constitutional resilience, the worldwide trend on democratic and constitutional erosion is still in place. Against this background, the seminar series on constitutionalism and democracy aim to create an online forum of topical, vivid, and interactive academic debates. This series of events provide opportunity for distinguished, emerging, and early career scholars to discuss the main concerns and challenges affecting the current constitutional jurisdictions around the world from the perspective of comparative constitutional analysis. We have already discussed the future of constitutional changes with Richard Albert and Giuliano Benvindo, abusive constitutional borrowing with Rosalind Dixon, David Landau, and Mia Versteeg. We talked about why the party is over with Kaimlin Chapela and Anaida Salgado. I talked about illiberal constitutionalism as a research project with Juliana Alvim. And today we have the honor to host as keynote speaker Professor Heinz Klug from University of Wisconsin Law School, who is also a visiting professor in the School of Law at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. Professor Klug's book on South Africa's democratic transition, Constituting Democracy, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2000. To act as a discussant in this panel, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Berihun Gebeye, who is a Humboldt postdoctoral research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, and a visiting professor at the Central European University in Vienna. Dr. Gebeye's book on a theory of African constitutionalism was published recently by Oxford University Press. Both of them are distinguished scholars in the field of African constitutionalism, and we are honored that they have accepted our invitation to talk about constitutional democracy and accountability, political parties, and constitutional accountability in post-apartheid South Africa. The format of this event today is the following. First, our keynote speaker talks about the South African experience on constitutional democracy and accountability for more or less 30 minutes. Our discussant has 15 minutes for sharing his views and comments, and maybe he could also put the topic into a wider African perspective. And after that, we will have a Q&A session in which the audience can make comments and ask questions. Please, for this, use the chat function. I would like to thank our team, Ulysses, Ana Luisa, Bruno, and Natasha, for helping us in the organization of this series. And obviously, I don't need to introduce you, Emilio Meyer, who is the co-organizer with me of the seminar series. As you know, probably the videos of the seminar series are already available on YouTube, and we are recording this panel too. If you disagree with that, please turn off your cameras. Now, Professor Klug and Dr. Gebeye, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. And I also would like to welcome the audience. Thanks for joining us today. Professor Klug, I'm looking forward to your presentation, especially in the light of the Hungarian public discussion about how to hold responsible the power holders and the public or other figures of Orban's illiberal state if the now opposition parties win the election next year. Accountability is also an important issue, for instance, here in Brazil, where there is a strong demand for holding the president responsible for his mismanagement of the pandemic. Thank you again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you both to Tamir and Emilio for this kind invitation. I'm really honored to be able to speak and be part of the seminar. So I want to, in the 30 minutes that I'm going to talk, I'm going to do a brief introduction that will give a bit of an overview of the context, particularly the present context in South Africa. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about political parties in South Africa and their relationship to the electoral system that exists. And then I'll turn to exactly what role does the Constitution play in either furthering this constitutional democracy or framing it. And then I'll turn to the role of independent institutions, and then finally a little conclusion. So firstly, in the terms of the present context, our seminar today takes place just a couple of weeks before the next local government elections in South Africa, which is really significant because it was the previous local government elections in 2016 that in fact gave the impetus for the removal eventually of Jacob Zuma, the previous president. And when we talk about accountability, particularly in the South African context, it's very closely related to this question of political parties, simply because in the 27 years of democracy in South Africa, we have had 2 presidents removed from office, but neither of them were removed through the constitutional process. They were both forced to resign from within the political party. So there's really a disjuncture between the constitutional design, if you like, and the actual political practice. If you have the removal of 2 democratically elected presidents based solely on internal party politics, as opposed to being part of formal removal because through the constitutional system. This present moment, this election that's about to take place now on the 1st of November, is significant because, again, it looks like the ANC will be losing positions, not enough to dramatically change its position in the society, but it'll be interesting to watch both if there's a drop in the turnout. So, in national elections, we've had over 60% turnout, and in the 2016, it dropped to 58% turnout, and the question is whether it'll drop even further on November 1st. And also the question is, will local government change hands? Will opposition parties be able to make some gain in local government, even though they seem to make very little gain at the national level? And of course, that's related to the nature of the electoral system. This also takes place in the context of 2 other things. Firstly, extraordinary inequality in South Africa. The top 1% control nearly 90% of the wealth of the country. And wealth is the important key point here because, of course, today South Africa has proudly doubled its middle class. So we had a middle class that was white under apartheid, and now we have equal numbers of Black people in the middle class. The trouble is, this is middle class by earnings, not by wealth. And when we talk about middle class, we went from 8% to 16%. Which hardly is a middle class, right? It means that the vast majority of people are very poor. Secondly, we have a 40% unemployment rate right now. And so what I'm suggesting, why I'm mentioning these figures is because this system is increasingly unsustainable, as would be my argument. Within that context, we've had both the removal of Jacob Zuma as president, and then with the State Capture Commission investigating what had gone on under his administration, his refusal to appear before the State Capture Commission became a matter of contempt of court. And Zuma was very briefly actually sent to prison. Shortly after he was actually admitted to prison, we saw a set of riots and looting which was quite coordinated across 2 of the major provinces of the country, Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, which is his home province. And in that context, we saw 342 people die. That was a horrendous moment this last July, so not very long ago. And again, it was totally from within the ruling party. No, they haven't yet charged the people responsible, but it's quite clear that it was quite coordinated. This wasn't just people suddenly rioting. This was a fairly coordinated activity. Over 300 cell phone towers were destroyed the night before the looting began. That is coordination. That is not simply angry people on the street. And so, and in fact, just this last week now, we've had an incident where supposedly former guerrillas of Umkhonto we Sizwe and the other guerrilla parties that fought in the war against apartheid, they took hostage 2 senior ministers and a deputy minister of government, only for 3 hours, and then the police arrived and they were arrested. And so we now have 52 people, former guerrillas against apartheid, or so they claim, because there's a lot of questions about some of these people who are claiming to be part of these groups, these veterans groups. And again, this is being coordinated by those within the ruling party who oppose the existing president. Right? So all of this is internal party politics in a system that's supposed to be a broadly democratic system. As I mentioned already, in these 27 years, we've had 2 presidents removed from within the ruling party itself. So let me talk briefly about the parties. So, you know, if we think about, sorry, let me just step back. If we think about the broad constitutional structure of the country, right, we have a democratically constructed constitution that guarantees a constitutional democracy. And within that, of course, the constitutional democracy relies on 2 fundamental mechanisms to try and facilitate democratic participation and accountability. One, of course, is the separation of powers and the allocation of authority to different levels of government. And the second is constitutional rights. And yet neither of these 2 sets of mechanisms seem to be what's functioning. And that's, I'll turn to that briefly a little later. So let's talk briefly now about the political parties themselves. And again, this is going to be one of the reasons I say we have a difficulty. The difficulty is that we have what I would term a unipolar democracy in South Africa, a single party dominant democracy. The reason, and you know, there are many reasons why that's emerged, but effectively the African National Congress, the ANC, created in 1912, has fought as the liberation movement in South Africa, is Mandela's party. That party in the last election in 2019 still won 57% of the vote, of the popular vote. And so it's still a very dominant party within the system. Very few ruling parties win 57% of the vote. And that was down from 62%, which was the average that they were winning since 1994. Now, obviously, one of the reasons why the party continues to have this level of support is because of this history as the Liberation Party. And this is quite common in various African states, but you know, you can compare it around the world. The Indian Congress in India remained dominant for a period of time, and then it fails. So one of the questions in South Africa today is history speeding up? Will this party fail? And if it does, what then? What will be left over? Because if you look at the opposition parties, the nearest opposition party from that 57% is the Democratic Alliance, which only got 20%, 20.7% of the previous vote. It's very regionally located in the Western Cape, which is an area where the African majority, as a result of historic apartheid laws, is still not a majority. And so even though 80% of the population is African, in the Western Cape, it's barely 50%. Right? Or in fact, it's closer to 25%. And so you have a context in which they dominate one province, this Democratic Alliance, and they get 20% of the vote countrywide. That Democratic Alliance, why does it fail to get greater support? First of all, it's basically a neoliberal party in terms of its orientation, its ideological orientation. But secondly, and more importantly, it's a party that was a white opposition party under the apartheid regime, a parliamentary party. And for whatever reason, they don't seem to be able to break with their own history. Very recently, they'd finally appointed an African leader, and then they threw them out. And so it doesn't exactly build confidence for the African majority that this party really represents their interests. And so it remains very small. There was a lot of expectation that the next party I'm going to talk about, the Economic Freedom Fighters, would become a dominant party. Here was a party that split away from the ANC, so it was a breakaway party from the African National Congress, and it was the breakaway was by a very populist youth leader by the name of Julius Malema. But Julius Malema is basically a populist, and he hasn't seemed to be able to do the kind of organization that would seriously challenge the majority party. Again, in this last election, they got 10.8% of the vote nationwide. And in fact, most of their vote is regionally based up in the north, where Malema comes from, rather than a nationwide party. There's a series of other parties. The next two that have any kind of support is down to 3% and 2%. That's the Inkatha Freedom Party in KwaZulu-Natal and the Freedom Front Plus, which is an old white traditional, was a pro-apartheid party, basically, 2.38%. There are various other much, much smaller parties, none of which get more than 1% of the vote. Now, they are represented in parliament, many of these parties, because South Africa's electoral system is a very pure proportional system. In other words, whatever percentage of the vote you get that amount of representation in the national parliament. So at the national parliamentary level, you get a wide range of parties, but with very little support. So they aren't even, a classic proportional representation system usually produces many, many small parties that then have to form coalitions to govern. But in the context of a post-liberation South Africa, and with the context of Mandela's party, basically it remains a dominant party democracy. Now, there's been an interesting constitutional development in relation to this. And that is, so initially, the first 1994 constitution, or 93 constitution, that was the interim constitution, that prohibited floor crossing in parliament. And then what happened is the parties, the two dominant parties at the time in parliament, the ANC and the Democratic Alliance, came to a deal, I think around 2002, where they allowed floor crossing for a little while. Actually, it was in the late 90s. And what was happening clearly was the two major parties would then, as soon as after the election happened, they would proceed quite quickly to actually just recruit all the small party members to themselves. It just made them more dominant. But then eventually in 2000, they realized that some of the opposition parties could do the same. So in 2002, I think, or 3, they passed a constitutional amendment that now prohibits floor crossing. So that option of internal change within parliament is off the table. But what has happened is there was a challenge recently in 2019 in the Constitutional Court, which said that the promise that the Constitution makes in the rights section of the Constitution, section 19 of the Bill of Rights, there's not only the right to form political parties, but there's also the right to participate in elections. And they argued that because the Electoral Act only allows you to have party representation, that was unconstitutional, because you can't have independent individuals participate in the national and provincial electoral processes. At the municipal level, there's always been a bifurcated system, where basically you have ward representatives, so individual constituencies, and then you use proportional representation by party to make sure that the local government is proportional generally, a little bit like the German system. And what you've got now broadly in South Africa is this challenge came to the Constitutional Court. And in fact, the Constitutional Court, in a case called New Nation Movement versus the President of South Africa, has declared the Electoral Act unconstitutional. So basically, they've now, and as a remedy, they've required Parliament, they've given Parliament 24 months to fix it. So in the next 24 months, since mid-2020, since last July, the Parliament is now having to design an electoral system that would allow independents to stand for the National Assembly and for the regional parliaments independently of political parties. Now, whether that's going to be multi-member districts but basically it is going to be a fundamental change to the electoral system, and probably quite important if we're going to maintain a democratic parliament. Because one of the things that constitutions fail to do, and this is not just the South African constitution, is deal with political parties. Right? Way back from the time of the US Constitution, the notion that the sense was they didn't want political parties, they assumed political parties would not become dominant. What has happened today, and particularly you see it play out in South Africa, is even though the Constitution provides very little with respect to political parties, they in fact dominate the system. And they dominate systems, whether they're presidential, semi-presidential, or parliamentary. Because basically, as long as you get a dominant a party that's very strong, it dictates to its members how to vote, say in the parliament. So even in a case like Britain, where historically the backbenchers would push back against the cabinet, after the mass parties emerged in the early 20th century, that was over. You basically, the members of parliament vote for their party. They protect their party, and so they protect the executive. So the historic role of the legislature actually disciplining the executive is really, unless you deal with political parties and how they work in the system, doesn't actually work anymore. And that is being clearly shown in South Africa, where even though the evidence of state capture, the evidence of corruption was extremely obvious all over the media, Parliament would do nothing. Just like when Zuma spent money on his own home and you had the Nkandla scandal and everybody was aware of it, was all over the media, and Parliament just tried to make excuses. In fact, try to make the whole thing go away. And so when Parliament, which is supposed to be what holds the executive accountable, is actually just trying to protect the executive under any circumstances, that system doesn't work. So if you think about the constitution in South Africa and think about where does it deal with political parties? Well, only, as I said, in section 19, it guarantees a multi-party system. In the basic provisions, the values of the Constitution in section 1, it guarantees a multi-party system of democracy. You are guaranteed a right to form a political party, but that's it. There's no actual regulation of political parties, whether they're internally democratic or not, how they function, etc. Now, we all know the problem with that is, for any constitution, is how do you regulate political parties? They are supposed to be part of the private domain. They're not supposed to be part of the public domain. And in fact, we would feel a little concerned if a government of the day had the power to regulate political parties. So either you have to allow your electoral commission or some other independent institution to do that kind of regulation. And even then it would be very difficult. So this is a tension that we have in constitutional democracies throughout, not just in South Africa or in the African context. So let me turn briefly then to talk about the question of the independent constitutional institutions. Now, South Africa did in the constitution making process adopt a series of institutions, which are the independent, the state institutions supporting constitutional democracy. They include a public protector, auditor general, the electoral commission. They include a South African Human Rights Commission, a gender commission, etc. The three that are important for accountability, which I call integrity institutions, are really the public protector, the electoral commission, and the auditor general. And what's really interesting is, if you take these three, the public protector performed an extraordinary role in actually uncovering the levels of corruption that had been going on in South Africa. That was the previous public protector, Thuli Madonsela. And what happened was the whole fight over Nkandla led to the end of her time in office, because the public protector gets 7 years, single term, no renewal. And so at the end of her time in office, Zuma was still president, and he got to appoint the new public protector. And Parliament has to vote, and the opposition has to agree. And what he did was he found somebody who they couldn't find any record of to show that she was really in his back pocket, but they appointed somebody called Busisiwe Machubane, who actually has spent her whole time as public protector trying to now protect Zuma, right, and protect his faction within the ANC. So that institution, so institutions are valuable, but when you can appoint who runs them, you can also undermine them. So that institution for the moment was dramatically undermined. But the fact is the state capture report had been issued already in 2016 by the prior public protector. It's that report that carried the day, that led to the exposure of the system of corruption. The Auditor General and the Electoral Commission have remained independent. The Auditor General continues, although there's been the appointment since under Ramaphosa of a new Auditor General, but basically the Auditor General and the Electoral Commission have remained independent, and that's important because the Auditor General continues to point out that sections of government, municipalities, etc., are not actually in conformance with the financial rules. That's important. It doesn't get any action, but it does get public exposure. The Electoral Commission has remained independent, and indeed we continue to have clean elections in South Africa. Of course, one of the reasons we have that, and one of the reasons it remains independent, is because that's not seen as a threat by the ANC. Right? The ANC leadership does not see elections as a threat, because in fact they win them. So we have a serious issue there, right? You want free and open elections because you win. Right? The question becomes, at what point, when a dominant party begins to look like it's going to lose an election, what does it do then? We're nowhere close to that yet in South Africa. So the issue then really becomes, what is holding the system together? And one of the points that I'm making as well, some of these independent institutions are still playing an important role. But there's two other parts to this that become quite important, and I would just do this as a conclusion. And that is, firstly, we've had the courts have remained independent. And what's interesting about this is partly this is structural. The fact is that you don't get to change the court that quickly, right? Particularly the Constitutional Court, the highest court in the land. The members of that court have a 15-year period that they are in office. And so, yes, Zuma did get to appoint a few of the judges, but it's been a slow process. And even though Zuma did get to appoint a new Chief Justice and appointed somebody who was very junior, and so he thought by elevating him, he would have put him in his back pocket. But he was wrong, because once he was elevated to Chief Justice, the other justices worked with him and made sure that he remained within the tradition of the court. And so even though he, and he's just in fact ended his term this month. So Justice Mogoeng is no longer Chief Justice, and Ramaphosa is now getting to appoint a new Chief Justice of South Africa. And so even though the appointments process has remained controversial, the Judicial Service Commission, which is pretty dominated by the political side, has been very controversial in its processes. In fact, they've now had a second round of looking for new justices for the Constitutional Court. So it's not that this is unproblematic, but the process at least has not fallen apart. It remains in place. The second point, which is also very important, is because we require a 2/3 majority for any kind of constitutional amendment, it was never open for Zuma and his supporters in the ANC at that time to dramatically change the structure. They had under 2/3 majority, and none of the opposition parties would support them. Now, something interesting started happening towards the end of Zuma's term. Is what Zuma did was he introduced the proposal that they should allow expropriation of land without compensation. This is a very populist position in South Africa. The fact is that we haven't had adequate land reform, that the legacies of apartheid are all around us still in South Africa. And so the idea of enabling the government to do serious land reform was something that's very attractive to the population. So this was put on the table, and it looked like the populist economic freedom fighters would in fact support. They were demanding it as well, so you would have 2/3 majority to change it. The trouble is, of course, Economic Freedom Front has no, freedom fighters have absolutely no interest in giving a victory to the ANC. And so every time it gets close to actually passing, they have a difference. So it never actually passes. They can't get it through. And what's bizarre about it, of course, is under the present constitution, under the present property regime in South Africa, the government is perfectly able to do land reform and in fact pay very little compensation. That's already in place in the Constitution. The Constitution even has an exception for land reform built right into the property clause. So the point is there's no political will to actually do this. This has been done as a kind of a way to try and encourage support and to promise, but not actually to deliver, which of course has become the fundamental weakness of the South African system. We have a wonderful constitution and we have fantastic policies. The ANC puts out wonderful plans of what needs to be done, and the difficulty is implementation. It doesn't happen. And whether that is state capacity, whether that is internal conflict within the ruling party, and I would suggest that more and more evidence shows us that the real problem is the ongoing conflict within the ANC itself. And that really goes back to the fact that if you go to the moment in 1994, where the ANC comes up from underground, from exile, from prison, to become the new government of South Africa, it also changes from a liberation movement into a political party. And in that transition, it opens itself up. It allows anybody who will pay 12 Rand to become a member of the ANC. And what's really interesting is if you look around and see who are the members of the ANC, who is participating within the ANC, it's a much, much broader group of people than were once part of the ANC. As I like to say, it's no longer the ANC that I was once part of. Because the fact is that members of the Bantustans, of the old regime, who were part of the old system, they all joined the ANC after 1994. And nobody said no. Nobody questioned their right to join, because after all, as an open political party, they had a right to join. And so you've had this division emerging within the ANC itself, where effectively you have the ANC government, which is often this leadership core that has a history within the ANC, and then you have the party. So what happens when Ramaphosa gets elected to the presidency of the ANC? He gets elected while Zuma is still president. But when he gets elected, the Secretary General of the party who wins that election is a guy called Ace Magashula, who's actually Zuma's man, and is in fact on trial for corruption right now. But Ace Magashula ran the party for the last 5 years, right, since Ramaphosa was president. And it meant the party was completely split from government. You had the ANC in government, and then you had the ANC as party. And the party believes that it gets to dictate to government. So within the National Executive Committee meetings, which are actually the decision-making body of the party, you've got 80 people present from all the different factions and no votes taken. They always look for consensus. And that means that the faction who doesn't want development things to go forward or accountability just has to object. And that's what's been going on now for a number of years, which really is paralysis. And that also explains the failure. It's not just capacity, but the failure of government to make decisions, even decisions to prosecute. Now, what has happened under Ramaphosa, and I will end here, is that he slowly but surely allowed the more independent institutions, the National Prosecuting Authority, the Tax Authority, etc. They got rid of the corrupt people in those bodies, and they're allowing these bodies a certain amount of independence as they reconstruct themselves. So the Tax party, the tax department is starting to actually function again. It had been completely crippled under Zuma. The National Prosecuting Authority is beginning to function, although that is even a slower process. It seems like the Zuma people actually destroyed a lot of the files. They got rid of evidence. They managed to do enormous amount of damage within the National Prosecuting Authority. And now they're trying to rebuild. So they keep on saying to us, wait, we're rebuilding, eventually we will act. But at this point in time, with this hostage taking of the ministers this last week, with the violence that happened in July, this time is running out. There needs to be action. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and during which I was like trying to draw some parallel between South Africa and Hungary in terms of party politics. But maybe I shouldn't talk about this, but maybe I would invite Professor Dr. Gebeye to share his thoughts about this lecture.
Thank you so much, Timia, for and the entire team behind this wonderful seminar series on constitutionalism and democracy. And it's also really an honor for me to share this forum with all of you, especially to be a discussant to Professor Klug's lecture today. So what I will do in the time I have is, on the one hand, build on the lecture and also his, excellent chapter, which was part of his Constitutional Democracy in Crisis, bringing the South African experience. So I will be talking briefly about corruption, political parties, and constitutional democracy in South Africa. And then I will try to identify some of the major interventions Professor Klug is making, and then I will ask, obviously, some questions. So from this lecture, my understanding is that the Professor Klug gave us a detailed account of the inner workings of South African democracy. And in this, there are two stories. One is the continuity of corruption with South African transition in the 1990s. That corruption being there. So what is unique about corruption? In the Zuma presidency, after the private interests, and they have been using what
Berihun, I think that you are probably facing some problems with your connection. We cannot hear you properly.
Okay.
Maybe try.
So can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes. Now it's better.
Okay. So the first story is there is corruption with the transition, and then the second story is about institutions. Institutions, both political parties and constitutional institutions, which seems to facilitate and also combat corruption at the same time. So the ANC and some state institutions, including the presidency, especially during Zuma, seems to facilitate corruption. But at the same time, as we heard, the party and some state institutions, especially the public protector, has been playing an important role in combating corruption. So here there is, as Professor Klug said, South Africa has nice institutions, but these institutions are also vulnerable to capture, and this raises a unique problem to constitutional democracy. We really hear from today's lecture and also from the this chapter on is beyond, especially in comparative constitutions, beyond the emphatic celebrations of South African democracy, especially the early days of transition, crisis, there has been always there, and now we have also institutions which could also fight back even state capture or actions of state capture. So I think this is a situation. So one thing which came out is the relationship between corruption and constitutionalism, and the other is political parties and constitutionalism. And the greatest danger to constitutional democracy, at least in South Africa, comes from corruption, especially state capture, and the conflict this may generate among political within the party and within the state. And these circumstances are somehow different. So, but the kind of problem South Africa faces is systemic. And I think, also Professor Klug said, it's also related to the nature of constitutional democracy itself. Constitutional democracy has some assumptions that separation of powers, rights, and free, fair, and periodic elections would create an open and democratic society. So at the best of times, what constitutional democracies can do is to punish the bad apples and reward the good ones. But they may not catch the bad apples from doing some damage. So regardless if constitutional democracies can catch and those bad apples and punish them effectively and efficiently, we may say that they are somehow working well, and the damage they have caused is simply part of the everyday life of constitutional democracies. So considering this, the existence of the institution of the public protector in South Africa that produced the state capture report not only help us see the state of corruption in that country, but also shows us the capacity of institutional innovation in defending democracy. So here I would love to hear more from you about whether South African constitutional democracy, both in its institutional and normative frameworks, takes the problems of systemic corruption and especially political powers, oligarchic tendencies very seriously. We have seen the public protector, which produced this report, and then now we have a different person in the office, and then it looks like the state could be captured, and then who really protect the state institutions, including the independent ones, from capture. And the second is in terms of the role of political parties in a constitutional democracy. We know that political parties are an essential element of representative democracy, and they perform important functions as intermediaries. But the party system in South Africa, as you also presented, is almost different and unique in some ways. It's unipolar, revolving around the ANC. And the ANC may not face at least a major electoral defeat anytime soon. So in these circumstances, if regular elections, have little impact in regulating the behaviors and actions of the ANC as a party, how can we make the party, as a whole accountable beyond punishing those parameters within the party and the state accountability system. You talked about in your lecture about constitutionally regulating parties, but also, I would also like to hear, one, whether we should regulate political parties and what sort of impact this will have, especially to the ANC and other opposition parties in the South African context. And the other, I have 3 other questions. So the first one is related to the people. Whenever we talk about constitutional democracy in different places like Hungary or Poland and in many other places, in one or another way, the people is involved in that story. So either there is a populist leader or a party who speaks on behalf of the common people and claims to represent or defend them. So, and at the same time, political and constitutional institutions that consider the common people in decision-making processes seems to be part of the diagnosis of the crisis. So in this regard, we have, a new books who talk about this. We can mention Camila Vergara's Systemic Corruption, Helen Landmore's Open Democracy, and now we have Boyan Vugaric and Mark Tushnet's Power to the People, where they want to democratize decision-making through citizens or local assemblies and different sorts of mechanisms that involve the people directly. So my question is, how is the story of the common people figures in the backsliding of constitutional democracy in South Africa, at least related to the Zuma presidency? Or is this, you also talked about in your lecture, or is the backsliding story has to do with the power struggle within the ANC? And a related question is whether you see a potential in further democratization of the decision-making processes in South Africa, citizen assemblies, and things along those lines. So generally, what is the way out of state capture and corruption? Because it seems to be the problem South Africa faces seems to be somehow unique and also general to constitutional democracies elsewhere. So what is the way out of state capture and systemic corruption? And the second is related to corruption and constitutional institutions. On the one hand, the fact that we see the state of corruption in South Africa shows the strength of its institutions, but at the same time, the level of corruption and the degree and the manner in which it is done shows it's a very worrisome condition, which could, as you said, which could generate real constitutional crisis. So what sort of lessons, in South Africa, we have institutions which we may not find in more even established democracies, like the public protector and other Chapter 9 institutions. Yet we face this kind of problems. So what sort of lessons can we learn from South Africa's institutional innovation and at the same time also state capture to different countries, for example, in Brazil or in different countries around the world? And my final question is related to the ANC and the trajectory of South African democracy. ANC seems to me, for me, partly it is a cause of the problem, partly it is also the solution to political decay and political renewal in the country. I have, the resignation of Mbeki and now Zuma from party and government positions in this regard. So what do you think is the trajectory of South African democracy like in 10 years or in 2030? And finally, I think, I have asked many questions. South Africa is celebrated, I think rightly so, for its good constitution to create an open and democratic society. And I think in many ways there is a struggle, but as you also say, there is also some resilience in its institutions, both within the party and also in its constitutional institutions. And especially in the African context, we have been looking South Africa as a model, as inspiration to learn more. And what sort of lessons now, after some years, 20, 30 years, could learn from the South African experience. Thanks so much. Thanks so much again.
Thank you, Berihun. I think that there were like a lot of questions. So maybe I just immediately invite Professor Klug to answer. And after that, we would open the floor to the audience. We already have 2 questions. So please, Professor Klug.
Thank you very much. And Berihun, thank you for wonderful engagement and really important questions. What's interesting is about them, I think they really center around one central piece, which I started when I spoke about context, and that is the problem of inequality. And this is not unusual in a decolonizing context, that for a new rising elite, if you like, the only access to resources is through the state, right? There's the private sector, and private sector in South Africa in particular has remained insulated from the majority of the population. It's still dominated by a small white elite, right? So in other words, if you are an up-and-coming Black South African who wants some future, your best way to do that is through the state. And so what happens is, and this is the complication within this, is of course systems of patronage. So when we talk corruption, but we also have to link corruption and patronage, because patronage, of course, is part of politics quite often in its more benign form, where it's just alliances and political agreements and political alliances, and its less benign form when it involves access to resources, and when it makes sure that you can get access to either government procurement, which is the major one, or access to government jobs. And so one of the controversies in South Africa the opposition always raises is that the claim that the government has some kind of system, or that the ANC has a system in which it directs people into positions. And yes, at some level, it does deploy people. The language is about deployment. It does deploy people, but in fact, deployment has become a patronage system, right? So whoever's in charge of deployment can put their people in place, not just in the party, but also in the state. And the effect of that has been, because people don't have jobs, you have 40% unemployment, what do? You put your friends and your neighbors and your whoever supporters into government positions, whether they're capable or not. And that is undermining the state. That is really, in terms of the capacity of the state, that is a serious problem. And so one of the issues is going to be, so one of the question that you raise around democracy and democratic participation, yes, during the anti-apartheid struggle, there was a lot of popular participation, but that has been institutionalized, right? And one of the difficulties is, how do you ensure some kind of democratic participation in this period now? And one of the interesting things was there was a lot of, and the Constitutional Court has required in certain contexts that there be public engagement for certain kinds of laws to be adopted, but also to encourage this public engagement. And again, that is effective, but it's not a solution. And so that's why this new demand by the Constitutional Court requiring a new electoral system, right? Because a lot of this has got to do with the electoral system. The central leadership of the ANC wouldn't have as much control of the party if in fact it didn't control the list system to the degree that it does. So, I understand, and so this has been a fight we've had in South Africa all along. do we go in the direction of the German system, which some of us were arguing for from the beginning, where even at the national level, you have directly elected members that actually have constituencies, where the people can actually engage their representatives? Because with a list system, a closed list system in particular, you don't get that, right? That's very few of the members of parliament ever engage the public. And if you have a problem as a member of the public, who do you go to? You go to the party. You go to your local party structure, your local party boss, and that's just inviting patronage right there, right? So the nature of the system is difficult. You have a system that ensures as much political party participation as possible. So small parties get access, right? So you get more representativity at one level, but you get less actual representation in terms of individual voters and participants in the system. And that has to be solved, because unless you solve that electoral problem, you don't solve the internal problems of the party. So one way to actually control a political party is through the way you structure the electoral system. And because you can't directly intervene in the party. So you institutionally can try and create more of an electoral system. And that's exactly what's going on right now, the attempt to do that. There's no resolution of that, and I predict it'll go right up to the last minute before they come to some kind of compromise in terms of how they do that. What can we learn from South Africa's constitutional innovation? I mean, I think the Chapter 9 institutions were a serious innovation. And in fact, they've been very helpful. They're not perfect. As we've seen with the public protector, if you're able to get somebody through, now what's extraordinary about what they did was they got the opposition parties voted for this public protector. It's not that the ANC could impose whoever they wished. And what they were able to do was put somebody forward that what they spoke about, the way they presented themselves, it seemed like they'd be an independent public protector until the day after they got put in their position. And so that just says to the opposition, you've got to be a little more careful about who you agree to, right? These institutions can be protected, but you have to make sure you know who's coming. You have to look at the candidates that you vote for. And so you've got to take some responsibility for that as well, so it's not just the ANC that failed, but it's even the opposition that failed with respect to the appointment of the public protector that we received. So what's the trajectory of South African democracy? I think that this requirement by the Constitutional Court that the electoral system becomes more participatory and more open is important. I think that's a hopeful sign. But I think a lot of it still depends on whether we can get a certain amount of redistribution going in that society. You cannot sustain a democracy in a society that is this unequal. Why on earth would people vote for continuation of a system that basically doesn't allow them anything? And so what happens after 1994 is the ANC puts in place a social welfare system which is the biggest in the world. And that for a while sustains the system. But that cannot be sustained endlessly, because if you put in all the money into social welfare and then you get patronage and corruption on top of that, what means is you don't have resources and you don't have state capacity to keep the basic infrastructure in place. And what's really going on at the moment is the failure of basic infrastructure. It's the water systems. It's the basic systems of electricity, water, that basic infrastructure that hasn't been maintained and has been subject to corrupt activity. As that fails, that affects everybody. But it also affects the poorest of the poor even worse. So even though people have been given some kind of social security, the failure of the infrastructure is hurting them more than anybody else. And now politically they say no more. So they've got two choices. They either exit the system or they protest. And what's really interesting is if you look at the end of the Zuma period, one of the reasons the ANC was forced to respond and eventually push out Zuma was because there were public demonstrations on the streets of ANC supporters, of people who vote for the ANC, on the streets saying, this has gone too far, this has got to stop. So again, you get this tension between the government ANC, the ANC party ANC, and the ANC support base, right? But unfortunately, it's all within the ANC. What South Africa really needs is a decent opposition, right? And our problem is the failure has not just been on the ANC side, the failure has been equally on the opposition side, right? They have not been able to put together a decent opposition. Now, there are little green shoots every now and again, and it looks like opposition will emerge. But one of the difficulties is, why do the good people, and there are a lot of good people still in the ANC, why don't they leave? That's the question that gets asked all the time. Why don't they go and form an opposition party? Well, that's very clear. Who would walk away from this history? Who would abandon the history of a 100-year liberation movement? Right? So the question is they've got to get strong enough to kick out the bad apples. Then they can recover their own history. But nobody's going to walk away from this history. Right? Nobody's going to say, forget it, we're going to be a new party. And in fact, two groups have tried. COPE was the first group, Congress of the People, that broke away under when Mbeki was thrown out. And they're nothing today. They get 1.23% of the vote. There's the EFF that broke away, took a populist position, and they also now get, 10% of the vote. They're the most successful breakaway, and yet they get 10%. So you can't walk away from that history. That is a proud history for a period. The present period is not so proud. What do you do about it? Right? So that's I think is both the benefits and failures of political parties. They're very important to mobilize a society and to organize a society. But if they become as dominant as the ANCs become, they also become a unipolar way in which all the politics of the society gets sucked into the political party. And now you lose transparency and you lose open engagement. And it becomes a difficulty. I hope I answered your questions.
I think you did. Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting. And I think that we have a question which is related to your last sentences. And now, if you don't mind, Steve Ross, because you are with us, maybe you could ask your question directly. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Heinz already basically answered my question. It's an amazing comment on what I would call the trademark value of the ANC, which is it has this hold that precludes things. I was last in South Africa in 2019 when there were brownouts because of the incompetence of the state-captured National Electronic Company. While they were holding hearings with the distinguished Supreme Court justice chairing the hearings, they're having these brownouts. I was giving a talk at the University of Pretoria. It goes out. 45 seconds later, the power kicks on from the private generator. It happened again at my very nice hotel. The next day, I read that all sorts of small shop owners had all their refrigerated goods ruined because their power went out and they can't afford private generators. And yet this is tolerated by people who claim they are progressives. But I think Professor Klug has explained the internal dynamic and the, what I would say, unfortunate power of a trademark to significantly increase the cost of making any significant reform. If I could make a follow-up question, Heinz, your story about land reform strikes me as a dysfunction that we see in the United States, where people are more interested in looking good than accomplishing anything. What is that really the dynamic that explains the effort to amend the Constitution, but not to actually effectuate constitutional land reform? And if not, what is holding up the ANC's ability to do the sort of land reform that you are so expert on and you contemplated when Section 25 was drafted to permit the sort of reform that you contemplate?
So Steve, there's two responses to what you're talking about. The first is, I wouldn't call it a trademark. I think what one has to understand, particularly in the context of a liberation movement, is many people died, right? You've got a real history of people who struggled and died for where we got. And so were you thinking about breaking away from what you call the trademark, that history, you're thinking of leaving those people behind, right? So there is a very strong commitment to that organization because of that particular history. I don't think that justifies tolerating the kind of mess that then results, right? But it's not a question of toleration. It's a question of struggle within. The point I was making is what happens is the politics of the country, the class politics of the country, right, are now internalized within the ANC. And that partly goes to your second point about land reform. The failure of land reform has got as much to do with the emergent classes within the ANC and also relationship to traditional authorities within the country. So there are two groups who weren't interested in the progressive land reform that some of us wanted. One group was the traditional authorities, the indigenous traditional authorities, who of course had been strengthened under apartheid and became something totally different to what was the indigenous authorities in the past. But in the first election, the ANC could not be sure that it was going to win, right? So when the interim constitution gets developed, it's not obvious who's going to win. And one of the things Mandela does is he reaches out to those traditional authorities who many of our youth had died fighting in the apartheid period and pulls them back into the ANC. So suddenly you have Contralesa and these traditional authorities as part of the ANC. The constitution provides traditional houses of chiefs in every province and at the national level. This community has now been institutionalized within, and they have significant power within the ANC today, right? They have no interest in that kind of land reform. They still want to control the land as a way to control people. And then on the other, and of course they deliver votes. That's quite traditional in many African countries. And so there's a fundamental problem. The second problem is you've got a new, one of the critiques of Ramaphosa is his love of these cattle that I think he actually imported from East Africa. He has this wonderful cattle farm, but this is actually just reflective of a new elite that itself is interested in having land and having access to land. And so that, where does progressive land reform fall between these two class structures, all within the ANC, right? It's not outside of the ANC, this is within. And then of course, you've got all the corporate and other interests who don't want land reform anyway. So when they push from the outside, they've got internal allies who are not their allies, in fact, but who are quite happy to say, oh, look, we're going to have disinvestment. The corporates we're going to lose investment if we move in this direction. And this has been a process that's been going on from day one, an internal fight, which, the fact is those who support progressive land reform, we've lost that fight again and again and again. And the only reason the fight continues is because in fact, it's necessary. Right, that land reform is still necessary if we're actually going to ever get to a sustainable system. And so there's the tension, but that tension continues.
Thank you so much. And I think that this is time for us now to move to Latin America a little bit. We have two questions from YouTube from Nayana. The first is, different from South Africa, in Latin America, our presidents are removed under constitutional rules. Prof, do you see it as a kind of modern breakdown of democracy? This is the first one. And the second is, what is the role of the judiciary in blocking parliament's maneuver to ban minorities of accessing parliament?
Okay, so the first one, I'm not sure I understand the second one, but the first one, what's interesting, of course, yes, in Latin America and in Brazil, we've seen presidents removed under constitutional rules. Well, it's better that they get removed under constitutional rules than that they get removed under unconstitutional rules, right? In the past, we'd have a coup d'etat, and that would remove the president, and we prefer that doesn't happen. But it does reflect a weakness in the politics, right? The fact is that Gilma got removed simply because the coalition in Congress was not a coalition that was supportive, had enough support, right? So the Workers' Party just didn't have enough support in Congress. That begs the question, how did they not get enough democratic support in the democratic election to protect their president, right? So there was a broad coalition that had been put together by Lula and which Gilma then inherited, but couldn't maintain. And as soon as you lose that coalition, you can get thrown out. But it's still constitutional, right? So it's still better than an alternative way. I think it was unfortunate. I don't think Gilma was at all responsible for the claims against her. But as you say, this was, as the questioner says, this was politics. This wasn't actually a question of malfeasance by the president, right? So that, but yes, these constitutional mechanisms, like removal of the president, of course, can be used for political reasons. That is to assume that the Constitution is above politics, is to ignore what constitutions are there for. They're there to regulate politics, but of course they will be used politically, right? So I don't see that as a problem. I see it as unfortunate, but it's an unfortunate political outcome. It's not a failure of the Constitution per se. There may be weaknesses that one can try and strengthen in a constitution, but I don't think that's one of them. You don't want it so that you cannot remove the executive. Talks about the role of the judiciary in blocking Parliament's maneuver to ban minorities of accessing Parliament. So it's not a parliamentary maneuver. I think if you're referring to what's happened in South Africa, the Constitution set up a system of an electoral system of proportionality. And the first constitution required that it be party proportional. The final constitution in 1996 does not require that. It doesn't have to be party proportional. It just has to be proportional in general terms. And so we could easily have a system of multi-member districts that overall can be made proportional. We don't have to have a system where you don't choose the individuals. You also could have an open list system where you can have an electoral system where the electors actually do pick the individuals off the list that the parties offer, as opposed to letting the party leadership do that. And one of the problems in South Africa is the party leadership has been able to increasingly dominate the parties. And this is not just the ANC, but all the parties, because it's a simple, proportional, closed list system where you appear on the list is your chance of being elected in the next election. So even if you're a party with only 2% support, it's the party leadership who puts themselves on the top of the list and everybody below so that they get elected in that 2%. If you have an open list system, you can allow the electorate in their voting to actually choose people off the list. Now that does have a problem. It sets up competition within the party, but given the fact that we have no competition in the party, that wouldn't be a bad thing, right? So there's a limit, there's a difficult, every system has its limits and its difficulties, but that might be a better option than the one we've got at the moment, which clearly privileges the leadership within a party. And the difficulty in a context like the ANC is, who is the leadership of the party? It's not necessarily Ramaphosa, because the Secretary General of the party has a lot more control of the party as opposed to the party in government. And so you get this division between the party in government and the actual political party. And as I say, the Secretary General, who took control at the same time that Ramaphosa became president, was a Zuma ally. It was Ace Magashula, who was himself highly corrupt and is now, in fact, facing charges in court. So a big breakthrough that the ANC has managed internally in the last year, in the last few months, was to enforce the rule that was adopted at the last conference that once you are charged, you actually have to step down, not once you're accused. So for a long time, the party leaders who were charged with corruption would say, well, okay, but we must wait innocent until proven guilty. That is a constitutional principle. So as long as I'm innocent until proven guilty, then I have to wait to the end of all the legal process. And finally, when I'm locked up, that's when I have to step down. In the meantime, I can exercise political power all the way through. Well, that is dysfunctional. And we proved that that's dysfunctional. So now the new rule is once you actually formally charged, so it doesn't matter how much information comes out in the press and whatever, it's not the old days when once you're embarrassed, you step down. Now you actually have to be charged and put in front of a court. And at that moment, now you have to step aside until your charges are resolved. That has been a big breakthrough. Right? That is a potentially game changer within the ANC because there's a lot of people who are going to be charged. There's a lot of information now about corruption. And there's the problem with what Zuma did very quickly in taking power. And so he has a threat to every democracy, and I'm sure the Hungarian situation is very close to this. As soon as they take power, the first thing they did was try to control both the intelligence and the prosecuting authority and the police by trying to put their people in place. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time. Sometimes they can do it quite quickly. But as soon as they control those security apparatus, you don't need a coup d'etat. You can now control things quite effectively by just preventing investigations of corruption, by just making processes go so slow that it never comes to fruition, right? By disappearing the docket. That's become a classic in South Africa. The dockets disappear all the time. And if the dockets disappear, then you can't have a charge, then you can't be held accountable, right? So, but what's interesting is none of these are legal methods anymore. These are methods that can be exposed. And one of the interesting things in South Africa is the media has played an extraordinary role in exposing this. Just like we see the Panama Papers now playing a role, and etc. It's when now increasingly these global consortia of media get access to hard drives or whatever they get. In South Africa, in state capture was eventually getting the hard drive, which was basically by accident, right? The Gupta people had asked some company to come and fix a computer. And what they realized when they came to fix it was the hard drive that they'd taken out that was broken actually had all this information on it. And they handed it over to a non-government organization, to some activists who then eventually got it de-encrypted and found all the information and gave it to the media. And that took months. But once that information was out, it was over because there was clear links between these political actors and corruption. Right? But that's what it required. And that is very difficult, right? That's not something that can be done very openly.
Thank you. I think that there is some very important points here about this resilience, because now you talked about the media, and once it's out, then people just get angry, or they actually form an opinion about corruption is bad. And this is not necessarily the case in Hungary, actually, because we know that there are some kind of corruption, and then I don't see this kind of reaction from the people, or basically from the people, not from the institutions, because the institutions are captured or pegged.
But to me, can I be very cynical? And when I look at Hungary, I blame the European Union, because as long as they continue to provide the subsidies, the government of the day can continue to provide the people with enough support that they don't complain. Right? Because the fact is, as long as the government can deliver something, people usually don't complain. That's the sad truth.
Yes, and also I think that it is the strange situation. I don't think that I could really blame the European Union, because I think that, naively saying that maybe they haven't realized in the beginning what's going on. They still believe that they are still talking with some rational people, doing rational decisions from the perspective of some constitutional democracy values, and that was not the case. But I think that Emilio wanted to make a comment or ask questions, so that we talk about a little bit about Brazil too.
Yes, actually, I have some questions concerning some of the definitions that are in the chapter, and what Professor Heinz just talked for us right now. But the first question, Heinz, is related to what do you define as a constitutional crisis? Because I was wondering, and then I was checking. So I'm not saying that South Africa is in a very good situation, but as long as data have some importance in analyzing the health of a democracy, of course, empirical findings, they do not say everything that we need to know. We need to have a normative approach, especially for us that work in the field of law. But if you check on VDEM and then you check on the Liberal Democracy Index, South Africa from the transition until now still almost in the same numbers, something like 0.82, something like that. If you compare to Brazil, you will see that we climb a mountain and then we go all the way down. So we are now closer to what we saw in the time of the transition back in 1988. So, and then I was hearing you saying that Ramaphosa is trying to find ways to avoid or to remedy the state capture. And then I was thinking, does the state capture to a certain extent is part of the, let's say, the game? As you said, comparing to Brazil, the result of the impeachment, I saw the result of the impeachment of Dilma as something that is unconstitutional. It is not just unfortunate. It is unconstitutional because it is a result that the Constitution does not provide for, which would be something like to say that we can have a vote of non-confidence here in Brazil instead of a full process of impeachment. And then I was wondering to what extent those things that take place there in South Africa are not part of the democratic game, and the Constitution, to a certain extent, accommodates that, and we are not facing properly a constitutional crisis. The second question is related to maybe the third question that I would do. They are both related. And I think that we can talk about the kind of connection between the equality and neoliberalism and the way by which they are maneuvered in authoritarian regimes, and how the transitions, and we could make a comparison between Brazil and South Africa in the sense that they did not respond in a satisfactory way to socioeconomic demands on transitional grounds. We remember about how the NTC did not include socioeconomic violations in its repertoire of violations, of gross violations, and the Brazil still does not consider those kind of violations as human rights violations. So to do not comply with these transitional demands results in the situation that we have now, both in South Africa and Brazil, with all the differences that we must bear in mind. Those are the questions. And thank you again, Heinz, and thank you, Berihun, for your comments too. That's it.
I'm sorry, I want to abuse my role as a moderator. I just came to my mind, I really, I forgot to ask, but now we were talking about we can blame the European Union because they are giving support still, and they just after like nine years, they figured it out that maybe economic measures could be something. So now, may I refer to your chapter? You are in the beginning, you are writing that when does government malfeasance become a constitutional crisis? And there is a question mark. And I think that you haven't really answered this question in the paper because you left it open. I think that the reason is because first, as Emilio asked, what constitutional crisis is, and the second, how can we see that we are now reached the level, where the level is, how we can measure it? There is one corruption case, two corruption cases, or there should be like series of other events, or is it enough to have one? Isn't it that it's very, very difficult to just determine that now it reached the level? So isn't it that we can just realize that like from a retrospective perspective. And so if it is true that now we cannot really blame, for instance, in our case, the European Union, as I said when I reflected to your comment previously. Yes, so question is, when does the math isn't? Yes.
So the question of when is it a constitutional crisis? I mean, I think that you're right. It's very difficult to tell, but I think that for me, what's clear is when the constitutional institutions cannot function, right? Then you've got a constitutional crisis on hand, right? So you have to look, and so what does that mean when they do not function, right? And I think we got very, very close in South Africa when Parliament was prepared to try and argue that even despite all the evidence that what Zuma had done with Nkandla was not a problem, right? That this was just fine. I think when you see that kind of level, then you can say that the legislature there was no longer functioning as a legislature is supposed to function at all, right? So there's, at some point, it becomes clear that the institution isn't functioning. Now, I think we would have fallen into crisis when after the court upheld the Nkandla judgment, right? Once they went to opposition, went to court, and the Constitutional Court said, no, in fact, the Nkandla judgment requires Zuma to pay back the money. If Parliament had turned around and said, no, that it doesn't have to, they would have overridden the constitutional decision. That would have been a crisis, right? Then the Constitution is no longer functioning. So what I'm saying is that, in fact, we can go quite far down the road of dysfunctionality before we've got a serious constitutional crisis. Because for me, what does it mean once you've got a constitutional crisis? If you have a constitutional crisis that cannot be resolved, then the Constitution's failing. And then all you've got is popular uprising, right? Then all you've got is conflict. And so at what point do you want to declare that a constitutional crisis is actually in hand, right? You only want to declare that when you know that there's no way out constitutionally. And what I'm suggesting in the South African context, at least, we went far down that road of dysfunction, but in fact, it looks like the constitutional mechanisms are holding, right? That there's a resilience that is actually turning them around. And in that way, we can get out. But that doesn't address the issue that Emilio raised, and that is about equality and neoliberalism, right? And it is true. And again, but what's interesting is, of course, this is also about global moments, not just domestic moments, right? Because South Africa in 1994, end of the Cold War, a lot of the ways in which the ANC as a social democratic party, or even more further to the left in exile, would have imagined changing that society was off the table. There was no longer a Soviet Union to support or some other alliance to develop, right? The ANC comes to power at a moment when neoliberalism is dominant. And the whole question becomes is, what choice do you really have? Now, I still think there are lots of choices within that one could have, and I don't think the ANC made the best choices. But the fact is that the limitation of choices in a global context also matters. What's interesting about the present crisis and the present moment is that since 2008, the neoliberal moment is also fading away. And the question is what's the outcome, right? And one of our arguments and one of the directions the seminar is taking is to say, well, one of the problems is when neoliberalism fails as a democratic option is we see the rise of undemocratic means. And we see the emergence of systems that are prepared to overrule constitutions in order just to retain power. So yes, that is a problem. We've clearly seen this weakening of democracy around the globe precisely in this context. But what's interesting to me is, but the answer is not neoliberalism. That is now to a large degree dead. And we haven't yet worked on what's going to come out of it. Is it a return to some form of social democracy? Is it something else, right? And the something else is, we have people talk about, well, that's fascism, right? That's monopoly capital fascism. That's a different version. We don't know whether that's going to, where that's going yet. And I think we are in an interregnum in that sense, where we are between one and another at that moment. And to that degree, we have a more systemic crisis than a constitutional crisis, right? And so, you know, you look at a context like Brazil and, you know, there's still an election and they vote for Bolsonaro. Why, right? Why do people do that, right? They do that because the system as it was not providing. Right? The same reason they voted for Trump in this country, right? The system was not providing. And of course, all the uses of race, of racism, of all these elements that we've seen in the past. The Hungarian story is the same, right? It's the outside threat. It's the threat of the other. But these are the classic mechanisms that are used when all else is failing. And the question then is where's the good politics from the other side? And what can that promise, right? Is it possible to say there is an alternative, a viable alternative that is both constitutional and democratic enough so that people actually get the benefits that democracy brings, right? Democracy is supposed to bring benefits for people, right? If you don't get healthcare, you don't get any benefits whatsoever, why democracy? Right? Well, what's it doing for me? And I think that that's real. Right? If you say to the majority of people, democracy is not giving you anything anyway, they say, where's our options? Right? And then you get people who stand up and promise the world, you will have everything. You will have a greater America, right? 1950s will come back tomorrow. I mean, it's not real, but you can see why people who don't see it being delivered, right? Post the 2008 crisis, the economic collapse in the United States, the truth is, the Obama administration does not deliver for the majority of Americans, right? Never mind how much we think that Obama is a wonderful president, which I liked. He did not deliver, right? For whatever political and other reasons. And that failure of delivery, and that's interesting enough, part of what the ANC faces on November 1st now. The failure to deliver basic infrastructure, the failure to deliver a basic capacity to have a life, right? If the education system falls apart, the health system falls apart, the water system falls apart, the electricity is on and off every day, why should we vote for you? Why does democracy provide an outcome? Right? So the democratic institutions also have to deliver. And the failure of democratic institutions to deliver is a danger for democracy. It's not just the bad guys who are threatening democracy, it's within democracy itself. If the democratic parties themselves, in the small d sense, not the Democratic Party as a party, if they do not deliver for the majority of the population, why should we vote for them? Right? And I think that is a serious question that must be asked of Democrats and left Democrats around the world.
Yes, indeed. So I think that we are approaching the end of this lecture. I'm asking the audience if anybody has any questions at this point or comments, because if not, then I just would like to say that, yes, one last remark, wait, now. Emilio and Berihun, you are like clapping, right? You are not raising hands. Right, okay, because now it's dark here. I cannot see my own screen and my own notes. So my final conclusion is maybe that we could like take away from this lecture is that maybe as opposed to the other lecture, party is not over, but what is needed maybe a delivery, as you said, by the party and democratic institutions, and revitalization of party and democratic institutions. And maybe that would give us a kind of way out and hope for not facing democratic or constitutional erosion or decay, whatever we can call it worldwide. Thank you very much for your participation, for your interest, and for your wonderful lecture and interventions. See you next time. We will keep everybody posted about the next events. We will continue with this traditional lecture in a month, and then we would have 2 other smaller events about 2 books but we will post the information about each of these events in time. And I hope I will see you there and I meet all of you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Mia and thank you, Emilia, for inviting me. It's been an honor to participate in this series. Thank you.
Thank you again, Heinz. Thank you again, Berihun, and thank you to everyone who joined us today.
Yeah,